Good morning, Claire, and good morning, class. In today's seminar, we'll be discussing the Red Location Museum. We'll be looking at whether or not the building has achieved a relevant architectural expression of post-colonial South African architecture. Now, the architects of the project were Joe Nero, Heinrich Wolff, and John Blair. Now, Joe Nero has designed and built over 200 projects and has combined a professional career with an academic one, lecturing locally and internationally.
The project was initiated by the municipality with an attempt to include the community in the making. However, most of the decisions were left between the client and the architect. The architect-municipality relationship was significantly stronger than that with the community. Thus, the focus was on the municipality's brief, and although centered around community thinking, lacked adequate input from the community itself. In 1994 was the competition launch. In 1999, the construction of the building began. In 2005 was the opening. But later in 2013, the community strikes began. That is something we'll go in depth at a later stage, so you'll have to stick around for that.
Unlike convention museums that sit within a predefined cultural precinct, Red Location Museum aims to create a new cultural precinct within a township setting. The museum is located in the northern outskirts of Wiehahn, namely New Brighton, one of the oldest black settlements in South Africa. It sits within a community residential zone, and there's a railway that splits the residential and industrial areas.
The township is greatly significant for its struggle heroes, the likes of Odorangenza, Raymond Mhlaba, and Govan Mbeki. The context itself is community orientated, a community where everyone knows everyone, and somehow all of the individual activities are interlinked. It's a whole lot of fun. You have kids playing everywhere, neighbors chatting from home to home, and your infamous Gussie dogs running the streets. But at night, it's a different story. A life of crime emerges. People are left vulnerable in their shacks and left to fend for themselves. This is coupled by a lack of police patrol and security infrastructure for people's homes. Just last month, 4 people were murdered in one day.
So the people of New Brighton are very poor, the infrastructure is very far from adequate, very much a third world setting. So the aim of the museum was to create a new opportunity culturally so people can express themselves through dancing, arts and crafts, and also just bring a new economical opportunity for local people to sell goods to the tourists, and just an opportunity for future investors. And so the idea was to develop a master plan that was more than just a museum, to create more opportunity such as a gallery, a backpackers lodge, a theatre, just to develop the whole area, just creating an economical and a cultural precinct.
Red Location Museum is positioned in such a way that it creates a public square with its neighbouring buildings. The square promotes community activity and opportunity. We can see that the museum reacted to this public square by creating a public gradient from most public spaces to the most private exhibition spaces. Additionally, the internal theatre creates a pinching point between public and private spaces. The transparent entrance facade connects the outside public square to the inside of the museum, letting the community infiltrate into the museum. We can also see that Joe Nero wanted to challenge away history's experience within a traditional museum, which usually happens via a rigid timeline. He rather went with the wandering effect, encouraging self-exploration of the viewers. This type of wandering effect is similar to those of the locations and traditional African villages.
Cool. So when working with buildings of this scale, the challenge was to break the building into something that relates to human scale. Now the architect achieved this by engaging with 3 elements. Firstly, the industrial scale, which refers to the fact that the main building is broken into sections through the implementation of the sawtooth roof. Secondly, the shack scale, which is the space that is figuratively represented as shacks. Thirdly, the active scale, which is in the form of the veranda and public seating on the walls, which integrates human movement and interaction. The sawtooth roof was inspired by the buildings in the surrounding industrial area. Now the people of New Brighton work in trade unions, and the sawtooth roof acts as a symbol of these trade unions. Even when looking at trade union posters and art, the sawtooth roof is used as a common graphical element.
The material expression in red location is very much similar to the surrounding shacks, done in a mixed combination of cheap materials which are easy to find and easy to use, but have been used in a new modern way in the museum. The inside of the museum is set to reflect the inside of a shack. The loose organization of elements in a shack reflect how the elements have been organized within the museum. The theatre sits within the museum as an ornament, as ornaments are arranged in a shack. The interior is also done in a mixed combination of cheap materials that you would find normally in a shack. Okay, the museum gathering space has reference to the early construction of a shack. This gathering space in front of the museum could be seen as the beginning of the museum's journey and expressed just as the beginning of a shack's journey. The way the gathering space has been expressed could also be seen as a reference to that of traditional gathering spaces outdoors under trees. The columns being constructed out of gum poles would reference that of a tree trunk, and the pergolas out of timber, it letting in light as tree wood. Looking at the finer detail construction of the columns in the gathering space, we find that wire has been used to hold the gum poles together. This could be seen as an abstract symbol to that of the indigenous African ways of construction with reeds.
The green and yellow colored walls on the front facade of the museum reference to the bright African colors that could be seen in traditional African artwork and clothing. This makes the public square even more vibrant. And then if you look at the inside of the museum, the struggle heroes are commemorated as columns. This could be seen as symbols for graves, being a physical remembrance for those no longer with us.
The main exhibition space is in the form of memory boxes, with each box holding a specific memory. What are these memory boxes? They are symbolic caskets that migrant workers used to store their personal belongings that were reminiscent of home. These essentially became their memory boxes, with each box holding their specific personal memories. The original red location shacks were located in a Boer concentration camp in Kariga and later moved to what we now know as New Brighton. Red location gets its name from the red rusted shacks, so their physical representation of the memory boxes is inspired by these red rusted shacks.
The mode of retelling of history within the museum aims to do so in ways that represent the traditional African way of retelling history. Firstly, this is done by the use of the memory boxes, which could be seen as sculptural objects which tell a story. This relates to the African practice of making sculptures and paintings that also tell a story. Another way that the museum retells history in a traditional African way of retelling history is through the memory boxes interiors that represent a shack's interior. This provides a safe space for community members to come into and tell their own stories. This relates to the traditional African practice of retelling history through telling stories. Another factor that Joe Nero has incorporated into the memory box exhibition space is this idea of twilight of memory. This idea comes from Andreas Hussein, who worked extensively on the topics of history and memory. The idea is that something happens and slips into the past, and it is at the slipping point that the idea of twilight occurs. The twilight period is where you decide on what you want to remember and what you want to forget. This twilight period is represented in the exhibition space as the space in between the memory boxes. This space is seen as a reflection space where you reflect on the past that you have just experienced within the memory box. One of the key design drivers behind this project was to search and find a new post-colonial architecture. The idea was to return to the rich African culture which existed before colonial intervention. So we find that post-colonial architecture seeks to return to pre-colonial ideas, concepts and traditions, but to do this in a new and modern way.
So Gideon, do you think Joe achieved post-colonial architecture?
Well, after looking at all the aspects, among other things looking at symbols and how it's been incorporated into the design and how the building has been expressed,
I do believe that Joe has successfully achieved a post-colonial architecture.
But wait, another thing to remember is that the people of New Brighton, most of those people don't even have basic living essentials. I mean, those people don't have houses and necessary facilities, so we have to ask ourselves the question, why was the museum even built? Especially when you take into consideration how much the museum actually cost. I mean, even at the beginning of the project, there were so many controversies as to whether it should have even been built. The people who originally stayed there, where the museum has now been built, have been relocated, and these people were promised houses, but the houses were only built at a later stage, and they had to find other alternative places to stay. During the museum's construction, the municipality promised houses, but there was no sign of these houses being built. As a result of this, the people began to strike and throw human feces at the museum while it was under construction. After many back and forth disputes between the community and the municipality, the museum was closed in 2013.
Although the closing of the museum could be seen as an unnecessary tragedy, the fact of the matter is that people need their basic essentials like schools, houses, and other facilities. Giving them a museum does open opportunities, but it does not solve these core issues. In the end, they are still left with nothing. Another point to consider is the fact that the building might just have been an innocent bystander to all this turmoil. The main dispute was between the community and the municipality, where the museum functioned as a catalyst to bring to light already existing problems and faults, which were mainly that the people's needs weren't being met by the government. We could say that the museum fell into a situation where it was doomed to fail from the beginning. And although the museum might be a great example of what good architecture is supposed to look like, it was built at a time when the most important issue was that people's basic needs should have been met. The new post-colonial architecture that has been created by Red Location Museum could be seen as an excellent representation of the greater African group, but it inadequately represents the individual, as we know for a fact that an individual staying at New Brighton would first want his or her basic needs to be met before bothering whether a new architectural style represents them as a person. We could also say that a group is basically a multitude of individuals, and so if a building does not represent the individual, it cannot truly represent the group. Concluding from this, we could say never mind a post-colonial architecture, never mind whether white skin and black mask have been successfully carried out in a design. If the individual has not been considered, then the building has failed. So then we visited the site in New Brighton, and it was quite an experience.
I mean, even for me, it was like quite interesting, like arriving there, because it's like you felt quite unsafe.
Yeah.
Even if you looked at the broken windows, it's like it made you think that there's people in the area that have got like malicious intentions.
Yeah, like everything was broken basically.
Yeah.
Tore down.
Yeah.
There was like everything was just thrown across the ground.
Mm.
Interior space was broken down pretty much completely.
Yeah, like when I got to the entrance and those oaks were there, that was hectic.
You know, it actually really brought me like a bit of sadness, because I actually see the building has a lot of potential. Even outside, you saw people engaging with the outside of the building, even those seats.
Yeah.
But now it has so much potential to actually be a community activator inside as well, but it didn't really achieve that.
Yeah. But then there were those kids inside the building. They
It
were
was
like
good,
playing.
playing
Yeah,
That was cool, yeah.
It was cool to see though.
I guess the community took it back, like
Yeah.
it made it its own.
Yeah. In the end, looking at everything that this building has been through, we might conclude that it is now a better representation of the struggle than it was ever before. Because although apartheid has ended, and we need to commemorate the victims of those terrible days, the struggle has not ended, and there are victims every day. The state that the building is in at this moment could be seen as a perfect monument of the struggle of the individual in South Africa.